So we, hopefully, together will find a way to rest our displeasure with the ICC, because if they'll do this to Israel, we're next. This group tried to come after our soldiers. Yeah, you can clap all you want to.
The International Criminal Court at The Hague has officially applied for arrest warrants for Israel's prime minister and defense minister, charging them with war crimes and crimes against humanity. This is absolutely historic, as was pointed out by the newswire Reuters. It cited a veteran war crimes prosecutor who said, quote, "This is a watershed event in the history of international justice. The ICC has never, in over 21 years of existence, indicted a Western official. Indeed, no international tribunal since Nuremberg after World War II has done so. In fact, until 2016, only Africans had been tried at the ICC, and that's why many African leaders condemned it as essentially a colonial institution. The current prosecutor of the ICC revealed in an interview on CNN that Western governments were pressuring him not to charge Israeli officials over their war crimes. And he said that a senior Western government official told him that the ICC was built for Africa and thugs like Putin, not the West. So here we can clearly see the double standards of the Western so-called democracies that boast about the so-called rules-based international order in which they made the rules and order everyone else around. And now that top US allies in Israel are facing ICC charges, the Biden administration is openly threatening to impose sanctions on the ICC, which is exactly what the Donald Trump administration did. In fact, before the ICC prosecutor filed these arrest warrants against top Israeli officials, there were rumors going around that he was preparing to do so, and US government officials wrote an open letter threatening to invade The Hague if Israeli officials faced any consequences. I made a video about that, which I will link to in the description below. The US government passed a law back in 2002 that's known as the Hague Invasion Act, in which the US said that it will invade The Hague in the Netherlands and physically remove any US official or an official from a Western ally who faces charges at the ICC. And 20 years later, now US officials are bringing back this legislation and threatening once again to potentially invade The Hague to try to save Israeli officials from the consequences of their war crimes. And why is the US government so afraid? Because they know that if Israeli officials who are supported by the US are arrested and prosecuted for their crimes against humanity, the US government is directly complicit in those crimes. It is the US government that is giving Israel billions of dollars of weapons and military assistance that it's using to kill civilians in Gaza. It's the US government that is protecting Israel on the international stage, vetoing resolutions in the UN Security Council that call for peace and a ceasefire. And in fact, a US senator admitted this openly. The Republican lawmaker Lindsey Graham let the cat out of the bag, and this May, in a Senate hearing, he said the quiet part loud and admitted that if Israel and Israeli officials are prosecuted for war crimes, we could be next. The United States could be next. Here is this very revealing clip.
So we, hopefully, together will find a way to rest our displeasure with the ICC, because if they'll do this to Israel, we're next. This group tried to come after our soldiers. Yeah, you can clap all you want to. They tried to come after our soldiers in Afghanistan, but reason prevailed. So at the end of the day here, what I hope to happen is that we level sanctions against the ICC for this outrage to not only help our friends in Israel, but protect ourselves over time. Ms. Secretary, your statement yesterday was excellent. The president's statement was excellent. Senator Schumer's statement on the floor was excellent. about the outrage here. They have destroyed the notion of complementarity. They have misled people in the United States Senate about their intention, and they shall and will pay a price. Mr. Secretary, I appreciate what you've said. It is now time for us to act.
By the way, a quick point about that clip for people who are confused. When Lindsey Graham said that if they do this to Israel, we'll be next, and then people started clapping, obviously, it was not senators who were clapping about that. It was actually protesters from the peace group Code Pink who were protesting at this event and accusing U.S. government officials of being complicit in the war crimes in Gaza. Now, there are a few things to respond to there. First of all, Lindsey Graham is a Republican, an ally of Donald Trump, and the only thing that he and Democrats ever agree on is war, sanctions, extremely aggressive foreign policy. And here we can see that this Republican Lindsey Graham is praising multiple Democrats, including Biden, the president, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. He was even praising his adversary in the Senate, the Democratic majority leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer. So we can see very clearly that the US government can only agree on bipartisan policy when it's in support of war crimes and imperial expansion abroad. And I should also point out that just a few days before Lindsey Graham made those comments, in an interview on TV, he called on Israel to drop nuclear bombs on Gaza. I did a separate video and report about that, which I will link to in the description below. It shows how people like Lindsey Graham, senators and congresspeople from both the Republican and Democratic parties, are extreme war hawks and war criminals. And that's why US government officials are so afraid now that the ICC has applied for arrest warrants against their top allies in Israel, because as Lindsey Graham said, they know they could be next. They could actually face consequences for their war crimes. And in the comments that he made in that Senate hearing, Lindsey Graham pointed out that previously the ICC had opened an investigation into the US military and NATO forces over the war crimes that they committed in the Afghanistan war. However, what happened in 2021, the ICC dropped those investigations into US and NATO war crimes in Afghanistan. And by the way, the ICC prosecutor who ended that investigation was Karim Khan, the current ICC prosecutor, and he was appointed in 2021. And Israel's state media reported that the US and Israel behind the scenes were lobbying to get Karim Khan elected as the prosecutor of the ICC. They lobbied for this prosecutor. He was their man. However, their war crimes have become so blatant that now their appointee in the ICC, Karim Khan, the new prosecutor, is being forced to act, because if he doesn't do anything, it will sacrifice the reputation of the ICC on the world stage, which, as I already mentioned earlier, has been very hurt by the fact that basically only Africans have been tried. This is the first time in history that a Western official will finally face charges at the ICC. Now, of course, it's not just Israeli officials who are being charged, and there are some people who are criticizing the ICC for its both sides approach by accusing both Israeli officials and Palestinian members of Hamas of war crimes. And people say, this is the both sides hypocrisy. And it's true that under international law, people under military occupation have a legal right to armed resistance. The Palestinian people have a legal right under international law to armed struggle against the illegal Israeli occupation. And this has been reaffirmed in numerous resolutions passed at the UN General Assembly. However, given the fact that until recently, basically only Africans had faced charges at the ICC, the fact that now Israeli officials are facing charges is a huge deal. So this is by no means to say that the ICC is now suddenly perfect and that it's gotten much better, but it's being forced to show a little consistency in order to save face, to salvage its international reputation. And if you look at the statement by the ICC prosecutor, it really is remarkable. It accuses Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant of the following crimes: starvation of civilians as a method of warfare as a war crime, willful killing, intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population as a war crime, extermination in the context of deaths caused by starvation as a crime against humanity, persecution as a crime against humanity, and other inhumane acts as a crime against humanity. Now, to be fair, there are a lot of people who are criticizing the ICC for waiting so long. Israel has been brutally bombing Gaza and trapping more than 2 million Palestinian civilians under a medieval siege for 7 months. And this is the first time the ICC has finally said something. Now, a quick note for the people who might be confused. The International Criminal Court, the ICC, is not the same as the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. What's confusing is that both of them are located at The Hague in the Netherlands. So when people say The Hague, they could be referring to either the ICC or the ICJ. The ICJ is the top legal body of the United Nations. And back in January, the ICJ ruled that Israel can be investigated for the crime of the G crime, which is the worst possible crime. I'm not going to say this word because then this will be demonetized and pushed down on the algorithm. But Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, mainstream Western human rights organizations have said that Israel has for months been violating that ruling by the ICJ, saying that it can be investigated for violating the G Convention, for trying to exterminate the Palestinian people. So that was the previous ruling from January. And then it took 4 more months for the ICC to finally speak out. So obviously, there are very clear double standards when it comes to the ICC. And ironically, it was the current prosecutor, Karim Khan, who admitted to these double standards. In an interview on CNN, the ICC prosecutor said that Western governments were pressuring him not to charge Israeli officials, and he even said that a Western leader said that the ICC was built for Africa and thugs like Putin. Here is this very revealing clip.
And of course, I've had some elected leaders speak to me and be very blunt. This court is built for Africa and for thugs like Putin, was what one senior leader told me. We don't view it like that, and we're not going to be swayed by the different types of threats, some of which are public and some maybe are not.
And while the US government has been threatening the ICC, Israel has been openly flaunting its impunity. Immediately after the ICC applied for these arrest warrants against Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister, Netanyahu published a video on Twitter in which he boasted, quote, "No one will stop us. No one will stop us," boasting of the fact that he knows that the US government will protect him and he will be allowed to continue carrying out crimes against humanity without any legal consequences. And by the way, it's not just the fact that the US government has provided billions of dollars of weapons to Israel to help it carry out these war crimes. There are more than 20,000 Americans, US citizens, who are serving in Israel's occupation forces, the Israeli military. They are engaged directly in these war crimes in Gaza. And now, Republican Congress members have introduced legislation in the US Congress that will give all US citizens who fight in Israel's military benefits that are equal to the benefits given to members of the US military. Because what they're really showing is that Israel is a direct extension of the US empire. Israel is an extension of the US war machine, or as some US military officials have said, Israel is an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the US empire, helping the US military try to dominate one of the most geostrategic regions on Earth in West Asia, connecting to the Mediterranean, where a huge part of the world's natural resources are located, important geostrategic trade routes and choke points. Israel is an extension of the United States. So when the US says we cannot allow the ICC to prosecute Israeli officials because we're next. They're acknowledging that Israel is part of the US empire. And they're exposing how the so-called rules-based international order, or the liberal international order, is simply the US imperial order. It is the hegemonic order built by the US empire, in which the US tried to impose its unipolar hegemony on the entire planet, and it made the rules and ordered everyone around, and then when it was convenient, the US and its allies were allowed to violate the rules that they created. And here we see that the US is allowing Israel to very clearly violate these rules, and Washington is directly facilitating its crimes against humanity. And the double standards of the US government could not be any clearer with the comments that Joe Biden's Secretary of State Antony Blinken made in a Senate hearing this May. And I'm reading here from a report in the Financial Times titled, "Biden Administration Signals It Will Support Push to Sanction ICC." And it notes, I'm reading from the article, the Joe Biden administration will work with Congress on possible sanctions against the International Criminal Court after its prosecutor announced it was seeking arrest warrants for senior Israeli and Hamas officials, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said. Congressional Republicans have signaled they plan to introduce legislation that will impose costs on the court. And in the hearing, the Secretary of State Antony Blinken was asked by a Republican member of the Senate committee if the Biden administration would consider Republican proposals and take it from there. And Blinken said, quote, "We want to work with you on a bipartisan basis to find an appropriate response." Here, once again, we see the bipartisan barbarism and criminality in the US government. Both Republicans and Democrats support these war crimes and now are threatening to sanction the ICC. The Financial Times quoted anonymous US government officials who say that they expect that the measures would target Prosecutor Karim Khan and others involved in the investigation, and the sanctions could be similar to those imposed by the Trump administration on the ICC's former chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, and the court's head of jurisdiction for their investigation into alleged US war crimes in Afghanistan. Now, I mentioned this earlier, and it shows another clear example of US government hypocrisy. Back in 2020, the Donald Trump administration imposed sanctions on the ICC after it started this investigation. However, when Joe Biden came to power in 2021, almost immediately, his administration dropped the sanctions on the ICC. And when the State Department announced this, it was Antony Blinken who signed the press release. His name is on it, boasting that the U.S. had ended sanctions and visa restrictions against personnel of the International Criminal Court. So the Biden administration is now doing exactly what the Trump administration did. And when Biden was running for president, he said, we're not going to go along with what Trump did. We're going to reverse his policies. Well, here we are a few years later. They're doing the exact same thing in order to protect their impunity, in order to violate the rules of the beloved rules-based international order that they created. Oh, and by the way, there's another incredible element of hypocrisy here, which is that the U.S. and Israel are not actually members of the International Criminal Court. They have refused to sign onto the Rome Statute, which established the ICC. But you know who is? Palestine. The ICC officially recognizes Palestine, and that's why Palestinian representatives applied for the ICC to investigate Israel's war crimes. So the US and Israel, once again, are telling the rest of the world that they must abide by the so-called rules of the rules-based international order that they created, when in reality, quite literally, the US and Israel saying, well, they don't apply to us. We refuse to join the ICC. We'll impose sanctions on the ICC. We will invade the ICC. But Vladimir Putin, anyone else, has to listen to the ICC. I'm not exaggerating. This is literally what the US government is doing. It could not be more hypocritical. I'm reading here the headline of a BBC article from March 2023, 1 year ago. Putin arrest warrant. Biden welcomes ICC's war crimes charges. Here is a Reuters report from March 2023. Title: U.S. top diplomat Blinken urges all ICC members to comply with Putin arrest warrant. So again, the rules-based international order means the U.S. and Israel do whatever they want. They can commit the worst possible crimes against humanity, but everyone else must listen to the ICC, and Putin in particular must face consequences, but not the U.S., certainly not George Bush, who invaded Iraq, and more than 1 million Iraqis died because of the criminal U.S. invasion of Iraq, and never faced a single consequence. So this is why the former top UN official, Craig Mokaber, resigned in protest during Israel's brutal war on Gaza. He accused Israel of the G crime. This is a top legal expert, Craig Mokaber, former top UN official. And in response to the Biden administration's threat to impose sanctions on the ICC, he wrote on Twitter, and I think this summarizes it very well, quote, "This is a decisive moment for the rule of law. Two rogue nuclear-armed states, the US and Israel, are on a global rampage, trampling human life and international law underfoot. Will international institutions stand up or bow to lawless bullying?" That's the question I'm going to leave you with today, because it's not just justice for the Palestinian people that is at stake here, and the end to these crimes against humanity sponsored by the US being carried out by Israel. Of course, the most important thing is that those end, that the Palestinian people are allowed to live, that Israel's illegal occupation ends, that its apartheid policies end, that its colonialism ends. Those are, of course, the most important things, but it's not just that. It's also the credibility of international legal institutions. For the first time ever, a Western government official, a close US ally, is finally facing consequences and charges at the International Criminal Court at The Hague over the war crimes that he has committed. The Global South has already said for decades that the ICC is a biased institution, even sometimes calling it the International Colonial Court. But if finally there may be some justice, of course, it doesn't mean that the ICC is now a great, perfect institution, far from it. But it does show that there might finally be some changes in the world politically. Unfortunately, I'm quite pessimistic. The fact that the US government is threatening the ICC so blatantly, the fact that the US government has never faced any consequences for its constant wars of aggression against Vietnam, Iraq, Syria, Libya, the list goes on. The fact that the US has never faced consequences shows that these legal institutions are deeply biased and colonial. But this is a historic moment. It's a very rare breath of fresh air. We should be realistic about it. That's what I'm trying to be. People say I'm being pessimistic. Well, I'm being realistic. But here at Geopolitical Economy Report, we will, of course, be following this issue very closely, reporting on it, analyzing it, providing context that is often left out of mainstream Western corporate media. And on that note, I'm going to conclude. I'm Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share to help to promote our material. And I will be back very soon. Thanks a lot for joining me today. I will see you all next time.